Mr. Thomas P. Valenti, with his experience as a legal practitioner spanning over 4 decades, has such erudition and expertise that educates and inspires us. Professionally, he dons many hats: an arbitrator, an alternative dispute resolution practitioner, lawyer, mediator, chartered arbitrator, facilitator, and trainer. He has offered commendable services as a community dialogue facilitator, locally and globally. In the universe of human connections and in the spheres of ideas and resources exchanged globally, sensitivity to nuances of culture and awareness about the complex processes of communication are important. We consider it a unique opportunity to be able to explore this domain with you. Mr. Valenti, it's a privilege and pleasure to welcome you to the International Teaching Month. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. You all have my voice?
Yes.
I thank Nirma for welcoming me back this year. I was there in person a couple of years ago before this lockdown, and I said lockdown specifically because I'm going to give you an example of something that just happened to me a few minutes ago about cross-cultural communication. And so thank you for having me back, ma'am. Thank you for the kind invitation and the kind words about me. Today, we're going to talk about cross-cultural communication. And I think it's even more important today because this pandemic allowed us to communicate with different countries quite easily. So maybe we're all in our lives communicating with people from different cultures and groups of people around the world. So I have a slideshow to prepare. You may see a different image that I'm seeing. There's a little bit of a tech issue, but I know we want to save some time at the end for Q&A. I'll ask somebody from Nirma to remind me about time. This may go a little bit longer than I wanted, but I'd like to ask you some questions during the session as well. I'm going to ask a few questions, and if you want to answer, I don't mind being interrupted. And so, why is this topic important today? For example, about 20 minutes ago, I was in another session, and a person used the term locked down. And they were using it in the context of understanding something. And the question was, if you really want to lock down this, which means a subject that she was teaching, you can go read this book, or you can attend this other lecture. Now, we all know that the term locked down has a completely different meaning today than it did a couple of years ago, because we learned that locked down means you can't leave your house, you can't go here, you can't go there. But the literal translation of locked down might now be you can't leave your house, not to make sure that you have a good understanding of something. And so these concepts are very relevant in today's society. We just have to be thinking about them. And that's why I thought this would be an interesting topic for this month, is that we can remind ourselves that our choice of words is very important. And I'll give you a few examples of that as we go along. And I'll start the screen share, and let's make sure you can see. You have slides? Yeah, you have slides. Great. Okay. And so here's our topic for today. And so I like this slide. And I'm not going to tell you what this means yet. But does anybody know this story? We're going to come back and visit it in a few minutes. So I picked this as the theme kind of this conversation, because this has a particular relevance about cross-cultural communication. And so what is really the problem that we have in cross-cultural communication is that we all make assumptions about things. And we make assumptions about the meaning of a word. We make that usually through the lens that we see people, or the audible lens that we hear things. For example, lockdown. And so we have to think about what culture means before we decide to let our assumptions control our conversations. And so I like to think that assumptions are termites. Sometimes we need to make them because we need to form some basis for our understanding, but they can also be a termite. A termite is this little, very tiny little thing that can destroy a whole house by eating away at the wood. And so let's keep in mind that our assumptions about communication can be good or they can be bad. And they can be so bad that they can destroy something. And so what we want to talk about is what is effective communication cross-culturally? Is it about what we want to say or what we want someone to understand that we want to say? Think about it as what we want the other people to understand, not just getting our words out, but making sure the words and concepts that we intend to communicate are understood by the people that we were communicating. For example, I was in a training this past weekend, and we were working with a group about guiding in the refugee crisis across the world. There are children who come from one country to another, and so teaching people how to relate to young children who come to a country without parents, unaccompanied minors, we call that. And there was a very high level psychologist who was being asked questions about, you know, how do you communicate effectively without offending kids? And she said something like, well, you can say things like, I hear you. Now, let's think about what that means. And I said, in translation, that doesn't mean anything. What you're trying to communicate there is that I empathize with you. I feel what you feel, or I'm close to understanding what you want. But if in translation, somebody says, I hear you, that means my ears are working. I can hear your voice. I actually, the physical notion of hearing is what the translation is going to be, not the emotional content that you want to communicate to the young child. And so that's just a good reminder about this slide, about making sure that the people understand what you're trying to communicate. That psychologist was trying to communicate an emotional aspect, not the physical aspect of hearing. And so this is the reminder, is who is listening? What are the people you're talking to? Who are they? What do they look like? What is their cultural context? How old are they? What education do they have? What understanding do they have language-wise? And so some people who learn English or a foreign language learn it from vocabulary. And we know, especially in English, our vocabulary words have multiple meanings. And so let's keep all of that in mind as we go through our talk today. And so what is this thing that we call culture? Right? In the old days, the original language in Latin meant to care for someone. In English, we have many different meanings now, but two primary ones. It's about religion, laws, beliefs, idioms, idols, things like that. In farming, it's about, came from cultivate, is we're culturing something, we're encouraging it to grow, right? We're culturing our foods. Our farm has a culture, but we also cultivate new ideas. And so it means to look after or take care of someone. That's way old language skills. We've had some scientists, social scientists, who have studied the notion of culture, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and then get into some interesting examples of what this is. And so the anthropologists talked about culture, and you know, we could talk to people and say, about someone, I might say, well, Sukrit, he's a cultured person. What do I mean if I say that? And I'm sorry, Sukrit, I'm calling you by name because I see some pictures on the right here, and you just happen to be the first one I saw. I don't mean to pick on you or embarrass you or anything, but I may use someone else's name along the way. No harm intended by anyone. And so, but if you don't want me to do it, give me some hand signal, the proper one, not the improper one, and I'll stop, okay? So if I said he was high culture, right? That means, oh, maybe he likes good wine, maybe he likes a special whiskey, or his food taste is something like that, or he has a lot of knowledge about something. He knows very esoteric concepts. He has a high culture. That's one way we learned about culture. This goes back to an author in the 1867. That's high culture rather than popular culture. Popular culture may mean, well, he knows about Justin Bieber, or whoever are these popular kids singing these days or whatever, or he knows about current movies or films, things like that. That's an old definition still. Then we come to something in the 1870s, and this definition developed. Let's think about this for a minute. That complex whole, some big group of things, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other thing that we acquire as a man or a woman, right? These things that we acquire. And it can include notions of customs, might be folklore. I know that I was in Scotland once, and what's the first thing we think about in Scotland is drinking whiskey, right? Scotch. And so we think that for some reason the culture in Scotland is about whiskey, and it has a lot more than that. But we have these customs and traditions that are in our society that make us think that that's the culture of a particular land or of a particular people. So anthropologists back in the 1800s, late 1800s, got us to think about these kinds of things. Let's move forward a bit to the 20th century. And we came up with some more modern definitions of culture, recognizing that really all of these very cultures are unique, and there may be more than one culture in one country or one society. That we can't say the Indian culture is this, the American culture is this, the Brazilian culture is that. We have to look at subsections within each country in order to identify culture. We may even have different cultures in the cities we're in, based upon the religions we practice, the education we received, or the society or home style that we grew up in. So we're gradually coming to the current days on trying to figure out what is this thing that we call culture that we should be aware of. And so let's go to 2006. So now we're today, basically. And Kevin Avrouk, who we respect for his research in this concept, wrote a book, and he took this position as that he found really 6 defects. Assumptions, remember we talked about assumptions a few minutes ago? Assumptions made by social anthropologists about what culture means. He found these 6 defects. One, that it's the same, that it's homogeneous, that it's actually a thing, that it's uniformly distributed amongst your group, that I might only have one culture, or Arpit has one culture, or Devang has one culture, or that it actually is this thing that we call custom, that's all it means, is the customs in your society, that it is timeless, that it's the same from the beginning of our life to the end of our life. So he got us to think about the things that were wrong, the assumptions or inadequacies in the old views. And let's see what he did once he came up with that. He came up adopting an older definition, but I like this definition, and let's see if you like it. It consists of the derivatives of experience, might be organized or not, more or less organized, learned. We know we learn culture, but the next part is important, and created by the individuals, introducing to us the concept that we can create a culture. I think if we had a time at the end, we can chat about, did the last 2 years help us develop a different culture by virtue of this pandemic? So we now think that we can create culture, created by the individuals of a population, not large groups, but you or me, including images or encodements, writing, right? We all have symbols and their interpretations or meanings, transmitted from past generations. That's we're gonna include history, right? But also from contemporaries, from people in today's society, allowing for the interpretation that we are continuing to create our culture. But also, more importantly, recognizing that we must recognize in other cultures that their culture is changing as well. So is India different when I first went there 10 years ago and today? When I come, I have to be aware it might be different. Or if you came to the USA 20 years ago, it might be different if you come today. So knowing that things change generation to generation. But most importantly, at the end, we may form culture ourselves. It can be formed by individuals. So here's the key elements of this current definition. And I'm not pronouncing this. I'm suggesting that you can consider this. I'm not saying there is no Bible, Quran. There's nothing in what I'm saying to you that you have to believe. But I would like you to consider it and think about it when you think about culture. It connects, so his definition, what does it do? All those words we just read, it connects culture to our own experiences, right? It's not something we learn, but that we create. It locates culture simultaneously outside and inside individuals. It lets us recognize that we may be part of producing the culture in our society or in our group. And it allows us to recognize that can be inherited and learned from our peers today. So it has this timeless element. It's not the culture that was there and that we have to learn. It's the culture we learned and are currently experiencing and developing. And so let's think about what words, with all that in background, and I'm happy to hear voice now. So what words do we, forget about these professors and these social scientists, what do we think? What are the words we? And by we, I mean everybody in the room today. What words do we associate with culture? Your chance to shout, type in the chat. I don't see the chat when I share a screen, but somebody can, if you want to use the chat, throw out a few words and let's hear what you think when you think of culture today, sitting in your chair, your desk, you're at home, you're at work, you're at school. What are the first words that might come to your mind when you think, what is culture to me represent? I don't mean to put anybody on the spot. It can be anonymous. Shout. If you're able to turn your mic on, just say a couple words and then we'll move on. We'll just give a second or two for people to participate. If somebody can see the chat, you can read that out loud. The next slide is going to give you some answers in case you don't want to answer. And we'll see how good we are compared to my reference. Yeah. Anybody have words? Let's move on. So here's some common types of words that come up in other groups, right? Style, value, traits, community, folklore, that's all those inherited things, right? Ethnicity, it can be part of a culture. Religion can be part of a culture. Language, of course. In India, you have multiple languages and dialects. We can talk about the culture of a city, the culture of a village. It may be a farming culture. It may be a tech culture. And so these are common words that people use when we describe culture to them. And they are asked to contribute to the vocabulary of culture. And so it also includes like this, traditions, right? I think most commonly when I was growing up, I thought before I began to study this a little bit that tradition was maybe the most important word that I associated with this. And those kinds of things come up at holiday times. You have, we all know what the holiday culture is in India, right? You have your own celebrations that the whole world gets to know about now because of social media. We all know about Diwali, and those are things that are traditions that exist in a society that are thought about by strangers to society as the culture of that society. We all have images of the powder, being thrown at everybody and all of that. And when we think of India, often we think of holiday traditions like that. And so for me, let's think about culture as being now, because we want to talk about how it affects communication, as having roots in communication. Because in order for culture to be transmitted, it all comes down to what we talk about, right? What we say to people and what we understand from them. And so why is it important? Let's have a little bit of fun now and talk about communication errors, right? It is how our word choice can be interpreted differently from country to country, society to society, group to group. So some examples. these are cultural gaffes. Usually we can identify things because of television, radio, social media. We can identify advertising errors. A gaffe is an error. And so we can identify those quite readily because they're in the public domain. And so when KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, entered the Chinese market, they discovered that their slogan, finger licking good, that's the slogan that originated here in the US, in translation came out as eat your fingers off. And so that's what I was talking about translation before, is we have to study translations before we share our slogans. We're dedicated to our slogans, but let's see what they mean in each country. And so General Motors, years ago, they developed this car called the Nova, and I'm old enough to know Nova. And so they had a problem. They didn't do this, but they were studying how to promote this in South America, where they had a big business interest. And they weren't selling many cars of the Nova in South America because they realized that in Spanish, it meant it won't go. Who's going to buy a car that's named it won't go? And so they changed the name of the Nova to the Caribe, and the sales took off. So it shows you the impact of words on our day-to-day life. Let's look at a couple more. When Braniff is an airline that in the US was based in Texas. It doesn't exist any longer through the reorganization of this industry. So there was a kind of a little bit fancy, right? They had leather seats. Most of the airplanes back in those days had some kind of vinyl or cloth seats. And so their slogan was fly in leather. They were trying to attract cultural people like Sukrit, that he's that fancy guy that wants a leather seat in his airplane when he flies. The fly in leather came out as fly naked in translation. Not a good thing. Coors is a beer, and they had a slogan that was turn it loose. In Spanish, it meant suffer from diarrhea. Not a good thing, right? The manufacturer of vacuums, and when I was a kid, this was the vacuum that we had at my mom and dad's house, Electrolux. In the American campaign, the slogan turned out, nothing sucks like an Electrolux. Well, because a vacuum relies upon suction, but not a good slogan. And so some interesting examples of how language needs to be appreciated before it's used. And it needs to be discussed in different language contents, different translation contexts before we decide to go public with it. And so these are big examples, but I encourage you to think about these when you're ever working cross-culturally, because gaffes, mistakes can be made, not intentionally, just unintentionally, through our need to get something done on time, or maybe we don't consult the right people before we decide to go public with whatever we're talking about. And so let's talk about the slide I told you I'd tell you about before. And so this is true, and all of these are true. So a t-shirt maker, the Pope came to the US, I can't remember what year, this was a long time ago. He came to Miami, and there's a lot of Spanish-speaking community in that part of Florida. And so somebody decided to make some t-shirts, and the t-shirt interpretation was, instead of it being I saw the Pope, El Papa, it read I saw the potato, La Papa. So just the pronoun il to la changed the meaning.
May I interrupt you for a moment? The slides are not moving.
No,
the slides aren't moving. They're frozen. I mean, it froze at some point, so we can't see the slide that you intend to show us.
That's the one I wanted you to see. Let's start the slide share over, if I can.
Yeah, please.
And I have to get to the screen. Okay, 1 second. And my screen is. Let me stop it and we'll start it again. I'm sorry for that. What I can do, ma'am, is I'll make this a PDF and I'll send it to you so everybody can have the slide presentation at the end of the session, okay? Hopefully we'll be able to catch up to where we were. And I'll make sure you get all the slides. Do you see these now?
Yes, I do.
Did it change?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Now on the screen, it's some humorous cross-cultural advertising. That slide.
The potato. Do you see the potato?
Yeah, I do.
So this is the one I was just describing. So I'm going to advance quickly to that slide that we were on to get you caught up. Everything you're seeing, you will see in the PDF I'll send you. So here we are. Now you see the potato again?
Yes, I do.
All right, so I have them advancing. Great. So this is the slide. So when the Pope came to Miami, they had this T-shirt that said, "I saw the Pope," and they changed it. It said "El Papa" instead of "Il Papa," and that one pronoun or changed the word from Pope to potato. La Papa is potato. Il or El Papa is the Pope. And so another interesting example of how we need to pay attention to communication. And so we know, what do we know about communication? Is that tone might be 38% of what people process when they're in a communication setting with someone. Words are only 7%. Physiology or relationship between you and me, how we are positioned in a room, our body language represents the majority of communication. And so let's keep that in mind. Tone we can control. All of this we can control, but some things we don't know about ourselves. I'm saying to you that 7% we should pay more attention to when we work cross-culturally. That our word choice has to be more considered or thoughtful when we work cross-culturally, because we have documented examples of when you pay less attention to the words, not the words I want to say, not the words my slogan tells me I should use everywhere, but the words as they are understood where the message is going to be received. So let's focus in our work a little bit more on the receiver rather than the speaker, because those two sides have to match. And as the speaker, we are in charge of trying to make that match work for us. We can't expect the listener to know everything we want to communicate to them because they don't have the understanding of the concept that we're trying to communicate. And so those gaffes were designed to make us pay more attention to word choice cross-culturally. And so here's another part of culture that we should keep aware of. And this is a deep concept, and there's a lot written about it now. The notion of context, high and low context, in how people perceive us. Edward Hall, this goes back to 1976. It's a great book to read. More currently, there's a married couple who have written current books about that, and I can send you that information as well. But let's talk about what context and high and low context means in communication styles. In high context cultures, the slides are advancing, ma'am?
No, they are not.
What the heck? You still on the potato?
Yeah.
Okay. So nothing now?
No.
All right. Well, let me talk about this. You'll get the slide. We'll just have a chat, okay? And so, in the current study of culture, we began to learn about two ways people process information. If you come from what we call a high context culture, high context means the primary purpose of communication is to form and develop relationships. And because we're a relationship-oriented society, the context of the information is what we need. We have to have some setting in order to understand or want to communicate effectively. A low context society, in that society, the primary purpose of communication is to exchange information, facts and opinions, data, right? Now let's think about that for a moment. Think about where you are and where I am, and decide for yourself whether you live in a high context society relationship-based, or low context, facts and information-based. In a high context culture, many things are left unsaid, and we just let the culture explain what's happening. Words and word choice become very important in high context communication, since a few words can communicate a very complex notion. And so if you can imagine high context and low context, let's think of it very basically, where the setting or the relationship is more important than the data. Anybody have any ideas on which countries or societies may be high or low? Any ideas? We came up with a very easy way to understand this. Let's think about high context, and this is based upon research done. For your purposes, you can think about high context cultures as warm, and warmer and low context cultures as cooler climates. I'm really talking about climate now, okay? It's just an easy way to understand that. And so let me give you the low context cultures first. My country, America, the northern states, right? Australia, Britain, Germany, Ireland. Let's think about higher context cultures. India, right? South Asia, the lower part of Europe, the Latin Americas, the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Spain, Mexico, Vietnam, the Philippines, China. In those societies, the context is more important than the words communicated. For example, if I was coming to visit and negotiate something in India, most likely you're going to create a context for me. I've been there a number of times doing work at places like Nirma and other universities. Nobody ever said, here's the address, come. They said, we'll meet you at the airport. They wanted a relationship to develop before the communication was informed. So you have a very high context culture. You're more concerned about creating relationships with people than you are about communicating the information. There's a book written called The 3 Cups of Tea. You've probably heard about this book, about in some societies, I think Afghanistan was the basis for that book, or Central Asia anyway, that we don't really begin to feel comfortable with someone until our 3rd cup of tea. And so there's stages of getting to know someone before we trust them. And so I gave this example the other day. If I was coming to negotiate something with Madhuri, I may, if I'm in India, I may say, well, tell me about your family, right? And she may or may not feel that that's the right question, but in many high context cultures, to care about someone's family or their job or how was your day is important to them, because it shows that I care about a person. And in many cultures, they don't want to deal with anybody unless they feel they have a relationship with them. If I went to England and asked the lawyer there about that, he may say, it's none of your business. Why are you asking me about my family? They don't have anything to do with what we're negotiating about. And that's a good, easy example to think about how people perceive our questions. In one culture, it's expected to build a relationship before. In the other, it's an intrusion. They feel offended by being asked a personal question. And so we have to study a bit about those things before we begin doing our work in different cultures, begin having conversation. Today's problem. It's so easy to communicate with a different culture. If we were planning a trip somewhere to do something in another country, we may have planned it a month or two in advance. We can begin to study that. But nowadays, all we got to do is send a Zoom invite, right? And click the button, and all of a sudden I'm talking to somebody in Vietnam. Have I given myself the opportunity to prepare for that? No. Because technology made it too easy for us to communicate cross-culturally. In other words, technology made it too easy for us to miscommunicate cross-culturally. So before you click that Zoom, maybe think about how can I make this person understand me better? What things should I think about to make sure I don't lose this opportunity because I made a gaffe or because I assumed something about this man, woman, relationship, university, whatever it is. I assumed something that I should not have assumed. And so we can think about our culture as our identity. But before you work cross-culturally, you have to think about their identity, right? Think about the other and the impact of that person's culture on his or her understanding, his or her communication style. More importantly, if you're negotiating, his or her decision-making style. An example. Some years ago, I was in Tokyo and meeting with the Bar Association, and we were talking about mediation. And family, in particular, this group of lawyer mediators did family mediation. And by family, most often we're talking about the failure of a relationship, so a divorce, something like that. And we learned, this was quite interesting to me, because I didn't know much about Japan. It was my first trip there, and I hadn't had occasion to do much research. I was there basically on a holiday. My son was studying law there at the time, and so I wasn't there for business purposes, but somebody called me to a meeting. And we had this very interesting conversation about in Japan, because of historical wars, many Japanese women ended up marrying American soldiers who were there and maybe stationed there for some time afterwards. And it didn't take the Japanese women long to figure out, well, these Americans are not all that we think they are. And so they began getting divorced because they realized that this wasn't really what they thought it was going to be. So they ended up in this divorce process, and the mediators found, many times there were American mediators involved, they found that they thought they reached an agreement because the wife, and this has gender implications as well, which is another topic for another session, but don't take what I'm saying in an unconsidered way. It's just what happened. In that culture, the women were not allowed to disagree with their husband in front of their husband. So in a mediation, for those of you who don't know, many times we're all sitting in one room and we're having a conversation, and the mediator may say, well, do you agree with that? And the Japanese woman would always say yes. And because they were not allowed to disagree. And so then we in mediation, we can take people and move them to a private room, and then they would say, well, that's nice, you agreed, and they said, well, I don't want to do that. And well, why were you saying yes? Yes, I understood. When yes can mean no is the lesson here. She was saying, yes, I understand what you want, not yes, I agree with it. She needed to be in another room with her lawyer, with a neutral third party, in order to say what she really felt, because her culture told her, I can't say no. If he wants me to do it, I have to do it. Very interesting conversation about culture and communication at the same time. And the power in some societies, and we're working, but we're a long way from home on gender culture, right? What is a woman allowed to do, not allowed to do, allowed to say, not allowed to say? What behavior is she allowed to even exhibit? And that's probably the best personal example I can give you about how gender roles affect culture and identity. What things do our society tell us we can or cannot do as a female? Maybe in some cultures, males have the same thing. And so in negotiation, that's a good example of how we might be mindful of our culture may affect what's going on. Decision-making styles in the country with whom we are working. And so what are some tips we can think about in negotiation now? Because we're all lawyers, we're all going to be negotiating, or most of us are studying law or have some interest in it. But in life, we all negotiate, right? We negotiate with our mom, our dad, our professors, our deans, our everybody every day. I have a great story, I can share it another time, about negotiating with a rickshaw, a tuk-tuk driver, an auto driver down in Hyderabad. And it's a very interesting story about culture and negotiation, but we negotiate every day. So cross-culturally, intercommunication style, most often we approach a negotiation as we got to talk. We have to do all the talking. Maybe we should listen more when we're dealing in other cultures and ask more questions, right? What is really a negotiation? It's a communication with a purpose and a goal. That's why we're negotiating. Does the other side have the same understanding of what your purpose and your goal is? Maybe you have to slow things down a little bit and say a little bit more and make sure there's understanding. So checking back and making sure perhaps that we use different vocabulary depending upon definitions of those words, right? And so the point of this comment I'm making now is that cultural barriers can create miscommunication. Lots of other things can as well. Our language choice, our tone, all of those things can create barriers. But let's keep in mind that a diversity of cultures can create a miscommunication as well. And our responsibility is to try to manage that diversity in some way by either studying it, more often than not, consulting someone in that culture to advise you. That's what was going on with the Japanese lawyers when we were talking about coaching mediators, is we needed some cultural input on how to manage that difficulty. The idea in communication in any negotiation is first to build trust with the other side. In the higher context cultures, those warm climates, you might build trust by not discussing the negotiation for a bit. Remember the 3 cups of tea. Maybe you're going to arrive, have a lunch, have a tea, have a coffee, just sit and talk. How was your journey? What's going on? How was, whatever the concept is, tell me about your family. What's your work life like? And try to step by step have that first cup, figuratively, the first couple of cups of tea, however you might do that in your particular setting. And that could even be a cup of tea on Zoom these days, right? If we're doing online communications, we may decide, can we just get together? Let's have a chat. And maybe we're going to push that Zoom button, but we know we're not going to talk about the deal yet. We're just going to talk about us. I'm going to tell you about me. I'm going to tell you about you. Let's see how the Zoom works. You can make a reason for it. Let's just check our connection. Let's just make sure that I can, you hear my voice, I get your voice, that the video works and all that. You can use that as your first cup of tea, as a trust building process. It might work for you, it might not. We all have people that are not that comfortable showing video. They can share their voice, but maybe they don't want to share their video. But think about building that relationship if you're working cross-culturally before you begin your your negotiation or your conversation. Always be aware, like the Japanese case, does no mean maybe? Does yes mean does yes mean no? Does yes mean maybe? And we have to keep ourselves aware of that and maybe develop a communication style that confirms what we thought we heard. Am I right that you have agreed to pay me $3 tomorrow? Maybe you need to do that once or twice after you think you have the agreement. And so confirming things is quite an effective way of communication when we're talking about cross-communication style. I have some ideas. I'll do this real quickly, then we'll go to straight Q&A. I'll just take a couple more minutes of me talking and remind you that you're going to get these slides. And so one of my mentors in this area is a gentleman by the name of Ken Cloak, a very prolific author, and has written many books about communication, mediation, and all of this. And so he suggests some pre-meeting techniques for bridging cross-cultural gaps. Number 1, discuss family status. 2, discuss relationship. Maybe relationship to the organization, how you find your work at Tata, whatever it may be. Ask, would an agenda be appropriate? Don't assume that we're going to type an agenda, because that may be too strong for the person you're dealing with. Ask each person to say what they expect of you in the negotiation. I have some expectations of what you're going to do, what your authority is. Ask me. What do you ask them? What do you expect of me here? Ask people how they define their role. What do you think your role is here in our conversation? Ask if they have some ground rules. Maybe we don't know that in this particular setting, at 11 o'clock, they need to take a break, or maybe they need to pray at a certain time, or maybe there's always a 2-hour lunch every day. And that in some cultures, we can go from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., order a sandwich in, and we're going to work right through that. But maybe we don't know that. So ask them, what are the ground rules that's going to work best for you? Right? And then you can always do a good job of modeling. By modeling, we mean, I'm going to show you the respect for your culture from the beginning. And our ability to do that is based upon our understanding of that culture. And so what is the failure of communication result in? A lack of trust, right? And so we want to make sure that our ears and eyes are open to lack of trust. What signals are the other side sending to us that shows us that maybe they're not trusting us right now? Or what do we see in them that makes us think we should not trust them, and how do we address that issue? The smart advice is to address it sooner rather than later, rather than letting it build. I'm having trouble because you seem not to be focusing on what we're talking about anymore. Is there something I said that offended you? Things like that. So let's go to Q&A now. I think we had a lot of information, and perhaps knowing you're going to get these slides later on, this can be an open discussion about anything you want to discuss that relates to communication cross-culturally, anything that you find appropriate about anything we talked about today. I'm quite happy to open the conversation up as wide as anybody wants and let the questions dictate the content going forward. I can now see the chat. I'll see. Question from Aditi: will cross-cultural communication assume a new dimension in the context of multiculturalism? This is an interesting, deep question, right? A good one, Aditi. So when we think about multiculturalism, are you talking about that any one of us may have more than one culture with intercultural marriages and all that? What really is our culture? Do we have one culture, or do we have multiple cultures within our group? Or do you mean the idea that there's going to be one world and that we have to accept the cultures of other countries? We can't focus on India as a culture or America as a culture, that we ought to move towards popularism, right? Is that what you mean?
We have a question on the chat. Can you hear me? It's
yes.
A question from my colleague Taruna, and she sees this online scenario as erecting a huge communication barrier when you teach online. So she's asking whether you have any suggestions about motivating the students to speak, interact, and express their opinion, and overcoming their fear of public speaking, especially on the online classes.
So I do, but you can see they failed today. And so I had asked questions during it and I got no response. And so what does that tell us? That a couple things it tells me is that, number one, perhaps in some countries, that kind of style doesn't work. Students are not used to interacting with a lecturer or a teacher professor during a session, that they don't want that conversation. For me, that's my motivation, is to have it more a dialogue than a monologue. And so I know that when I come and do these things in India, I'm very unlikely to get any communication during the lecture. And so what does that tell me? It tells me I got to find out how to get that happening in India. I've yet to find an answer. In some places, I've done some work online with groups this big in Sri Lanka, and they're better at it. And I think it is because of the person who organizes those events. But it is a barrier. How do we get people to do it? One way for me to do it is at times, and I did it with Sukrit, I called him by name. And why did I do that? I didn't ask him a question, I just used his name. It was my way of trying to say, this is the way we're going to go. We're going to call people by name in the hopes that he didn't have to say anything, and he didn't say anything, but it was early on in the session as my way trying to introduce the idea that we can try to make this more personal. Even though he's a small box on a screen, I was trying then to introduce the idea of interaction during our session. I failed, right? Maybe somebody from your country, if they were on this side of the microphone, could have done a better job at it. I've spent a lot of time in India, usually in my sessions in person, and I've done sessions at Nirma in person. We were able to do that. And so the question is, does this create a barrier? Obviously it does. I think if we were all in one room, and what I do when I'm in a room is I walk the room. Like I might be coming down towards the last row or this row, up this aisle, another aisle. And that's my way of being with you and showing you. And sometimes I might even sit next to you, Shreya. I might sit next to you and talk to you. I got the microphone and I may say, what do you think about this? I can't do that online, right? I can't come into I'm in the same, my box is the same size as yours on my screen. And so as best I can try to be in your side, but I'm the speaker. I have the microphone. You all have one, but nobody's microphone is on. I'm giving you a chance. Somebody say something.
We have another question from Sukrit. In a situation of power disparity between two parties, how can accommodation of respect for the culture of those who in the lower rungs of power aid meaningful communication and building trust?
Yeah, I really like this question, Sukrit, because it's one of the things I do in my life is we've worked with refugee communities in different places, and what we call dialogue is trying to empower people of different socioeconomic status. Sometimes in mediation, we have that. An example might be the Japanese story where a female felt that she didn't have the right to say much there. And so this is a skill to be developed. It takes an acute awareness. And oftentimes we have to tell people what we're trying to do. I'll use you as the example because it's your question. And I may say to you, and I'm going to imagine Sukrit was the high culture guy before, and now we're going to imagine that he's of a lower caste, maybe feels powerless. Maybe he's not even a man, he might be a woman. Who knows what he might be? You imagine him in some other spot other than this very cultural guy sitting in his chair today. And so he's with me and we're having some conversation about a difficult topic. He's very quiet. He's becoming very quiet. And so I may, and I would choose, depending upon what we're doing, whether to do it with the group or without. I most likely would take him aside and say, Sukrit, I notice you're very quiet now. And I might even lower my voice. So you see how I just lowered my voice? If I was doing it online, you saw me lean into the camera. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to be in a room with him. I'm lowering my voice from the lecture voice to the quiet voice. And I may say to him, you got quiet. Is there something I did? Did somebody say something that made you quiet? I want to make sure everybody hears you. What can I do to make sure that your voice is heard in this room? Because people want to hear you. And so we can try to do techniques that we learn online. I was doing Zoom training 5 years before the pandemic. We were using it in cross-cultural settings before. And so I became very familiar with Zoom. I can tell you about the Zoom that existed before breakout rooms and all these pictures and all that. But we can try in this kind of setting to develop a technique that we can use that makes us imagine that we're closer to someone. The whisper, right? Lowering my voice, the leaning in. And so we can do that in a big group, or we can use these breakout rooms. So how do we get the lower empowered people to feel that way? It's building trust. And sometimes we can build trust by having a different kind of conversation. If we felt the lack of trust existed because of the way we were behaving before, it's my job as the facilitator or the one who wants to create the relationship to own that problem and say, did I do something? Not say you're distracted, is what did I do to disconnect us? So that's my recommendation is, and that works, it can work effectively with disempowered people, but I would probably, before I did that, have wanted to build some trust through those 3 cups of tea concept before I had that conversation. I might even say to him, there's a guy that was one of my trainers in mediation many years ago, and what would he do? If someone was disengaged, he'd take a walk. He'd say, come on, let's take a walk. And they would walk around the block. Because he found that having a conversation when you were walking was a way to connect with people. We can all develop our own techniques. Long answer to that question, but good question. And it takes practice and study.
We have a question from Aditya. He asks, we see similarities regarding polarization of political opinions, both in USA and India, and breakdown of relationships as a result of that. How do we tackle that?
Yeah. If I had the answer to that question, I'd be a very famous guy, wouldn't I? This is such a rich question. I struggle with this, and I'll talk a bit about my country first. And I think polarization exists in my country because we have a 2-party system, and it's them and us, and we have too many elections. We have elections every 2 years, and so we decide not to do anything because if the Republican Party is in control now, they know in 2 years there's going to be an election, and if they can delay things, the Democrats may be in control the next time. So if we had less elections, we wouldn't tolerate the lack of progress by our government. The 2-party system creates polarization. If we had three parties or more create alliances. One party, in order to get the majority, one party has to agree with the other party in order to get enough votes to pass something. So it creates the reason to collaborate. In 2 parties with so many elections, all it does is create this polarization. You look at a country like Greece. I've done some work in Greece. They have 6, 7, 8 parties. And so there's all kinds of alliances going on. And they make alliances based upon the need. You and I, Devon, you and I may be together about an economic issue. But Neeraj and I may be together, our parties may be together about a social service issue or a taxation issue. We make alliances based upon what our interest base tells us to do. And our alliances aren't always the same. It depends upon the issue the government is dealing with at that moment. And so I think every country has this polarization problem. All we have to do is watch the news. I'm embarrassed at times by how dysfunctional my country is. And the social media, the news media promotes this taking of sides. When all this happened a number of years ago, I decided I wanted to have Zoom conversations about trying to get people from one side to sit with the other in our, like a meeting like we're having today. And we couldn't get anybody to do it because the only people who were interested in doing it always were interested in doing it. We never had the diversity. We never had somebody willing to come and say, I want to hear this. A very interesting book written by a woman. We have a polarizing issue in our country is abortion. And there's a lady who does this kind of work who had secret meetings with the pro-life people, the abortion people for a number of years. Nobody knew about it. And ultimately they allowed her to publish an article that told everybody they never agreed. They were always going to be pro and against, but they liked each other. They kept talking. Everybody understood why they believed in their side of the issue. But they never wanted anybody to know I was even talking to them, because their base said, don't even talk to those people. And we see that in politics now. They shouldn't even have a conversation about it. And so they allowed her to publish the fact that she was having and facilitating conversations between two of the most polarized groups in my country. And that it was published for the purpose of showing you can talk to people. You don't talk to them to change their mind necessarily, but to understand why they feel the way they feel, because maybe there's some part of their argument that you can find commonality. And maybe you can make an inroad to something if you find one common interest. And it's a good conversation to have. But how do we get people on the very, fringe people to stop communicating in a style that creates polarization? And we don't have that because they make money doing it, right? There's value created in their life by being those polarizing personalities. It's a problem for us, and it's not going to get any better, until we change. And it's you guys, the next generation of people. It's in your hands. It can only take. I say this very crudely, and I know we're over time, but I'll say this is. It sounds offensive, but I say it this way: in order for there to be change, more people have to die. What do I mean by that? I mean the generation that holds those things true. Culturally, they didn't necessarily pass it to their children. Their children are being educated and are smarter, and they see the evil in the polarization. And so when those senior generations die, you guys are all going to be carrying the banner, and it'll be a better society. For you. For me, I'll be gone. Any other questions?
Yes, we have a few more. Kritarth asks, how can we handle a situation when there is a miscommunication?
Here's the technique. Name it. The first thing is, don't be afraid to say there is a miscommunication, and recognizing it is naming it, right? So the first thing we want to do is say, I think there's a misunderstanding. Own it. Name it, own it, own it. Maybe I said something that was not understood the way I wanted to say. Can you tell me what's bothering you now so I can try to fix it? I may not know what the miscommunication was because I only know what I intended to say. I didn't know how it was understood. And so if you're able to, if you think you can identify it, you can say right away, I want to clarify something, because when I said ABC, I could see your facial reaction, or your response was not so happy. So let me say it a different way. If we're not sure, ask, what was it that I said that seems to irritate you? So identify it, name it, own it, explain it. My fault, not yours. And this is what I meant to say. And then the last step is validate it somehow. Are we on the same page now? Does that help? Some question that works for you that makes sure you fixed the problem. Are we okay to go ahead? Does that clarify it? Something like that. Some question that makes you get feedback from them. You saying it the second time in another way doesn't fix it unless the other party tells you, thanks, you fixed it. That's what we need to hear. You don't need to hear the thanks. You just need to hear, I got it now, or I understand you. If we're the person who was offended, you want to be able to say, this is what I understood you to say, and this is why I reacted that way. It takes a bit of power, and that goes back to Sukrit's comment, is that maybe those less empowered people don't have in their mind the feeling they can say that. That's why third-party neutrals, mediators, facilitators can have value in a conversation, because we can help them get that communication out. That's where that's where the issue is. Do they even feel they have the right to say, you just offended? Or I don't like your tone. Or I don't, you're making me feel strange. Whatever it is, they don't feel they have the right to even say that. And that's why third parties in conversations can help bring that conversation to the real conversation that needs to be had. Make sense?
I think you have already answered this question. It's a question from Aditi. How should we avoid trust issues in cross-cultural communication?
Avoid?
Trust issues.
Trust issues. That's kind of what we were talking about with, if you're in the high context society, do the T, right? And I'm not saying T. I mean, the T is good, but build a relationship. If you're in the UK in the low context, don't do that. They're going to think, what does he want to know about my wife for, right? So you do the opposite, right? Is in the low context societies, you may have the agenda. You may show them some respect for their time and have an agenda prepared. These are the issues that I think we should be talking about. Are you ready to talk about it now? Take permission to talk about it, but forget about T, because you may have the adverse, the wrong impact in the low context society. And that's how you can build trust in a low context society, is be prepared, show respect for their role, and acknowledge their position in the company or whatever it is. But don't ask them interpersonal questions.
We have two interconnected questions. One is, considering the fact that laws and policies highly represent and reflect the social beliefs and understandings, India is currently aggressively aiming towards attracting foreign investments. Can laws and policies framed in this regard in any way be a source of developing distrust and miscommunication in potential investors, considering that India is a very high context society?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so there's a lot going on in that question. So we have the geopolitical issues, and then we always have the perspective that other countries have of your country. And so historically, some people may not do business, and investors don't want countries because of corruption, for example. And so some people stay away from a country because they think, if I have a dispute with an Indian company, I'm going to be in the Indian court system and I don't trust it. Or I do some work in the arbitration field as well for a long time. And there's still elements of this present today. We don't want to go to arbitrate in India because the arbitrators don't work hard. They're a bit lazy. And so when I go for an arbitration, we want to begin it on Monday, end it on Friday, and not after one day somebody say, let's take a break for a week because I got to go to the doctor or something. And so there was a reputation that had developed that kept people, foreign investors, from saying, I'm not going to do that deal, because deals fall apart. And that's when we really have a problem, is how do we get a resolution of a default in a contract? Am I in court? Am I in arbitration? How many years is it going to take me to get this resolved? I need the railroad built, right? I need the water system put in. Whatever infrastructure an international investment company is putting into a country, they can't afford to be locked up in a dysfunctional system. And so in the geopolitical arena, all of that goes into, for those of you who are looking at transactional work, right? If you want to be a transaction lawyer, you're going to be thinking about all those geopolitical things when you draft a contract and decide which laws are going to apply, right? What jurisdiction is going to have control of a dispute? Transactional lawyers never think about problems. They always, they don't think about disputes. They always think we're drafting words, but at some point a default can occur. Supply chain falls down, I don't get my product. This is going to end up in before some tribunal somewhere. Where do I want to be? And think about the geopolitical impact of defaults in contracts. 2 years ago, and I think I did this at the International Teaching Day back then, is what impact did the pandemic have on dispute resolution? Is defaults in contracts. People couldn't do things, they couldn't get to appointments, they couldn't deliver product, whatever it may be. And how were we going to manage those disputes? We came a long way since then in resolving disputes. There's still a huge backlog of cases, but I believe in countries like your country that the interpersonal, I mean the inter-country geopolitical problems are highly present on people's minds when they decide to come and do business with you. You're fortunate that you have some huge, very successful companies, and the international community has embraced the smartness of all of you. Your intelligence has become a huge resource, not only in your country. The tech companies are all there, and other countries realize that they need you. And so as young people in your country, you're fortunate that you have education systems that make you prepared to be hired by the biggest and best companies in the world. But if you're going to get into law and decide how to capitalize on that, you need to have people not worry about geopolitical things. You can't solve that. I can't solve that in my country. You know, there are people who probably, you know, we've seen it. You know, people who just Facebook now. I guess there's so many people quitting Facebook because of the reputation it now has with regard to data management and things like that. And so we have lots of freedoms here that become intrusions as well. And so we're in an adjustment period here about people wanting to deal with even USA companies. There are people who hate this company called Amazon, right? Because it's huge. I don't want to say anything about it. I like Amazon. I use it, especially during the pandemic, but there are friends of mine who they wouldn't buy a stick of gum from Amazon because they think they put so many businesses out of business. So you can call that geopolitical because Amazon does work all over the world, and the impact of people's mentality about American cultures or American companies is quite impactful in business decisions. Anybody else? Tanae asks a good question there. Do you see it? How do we put across a conflicted, I'm reading it because it's the last one on my screen. How do we put across a conflicting idea to a senior authority or an older person who may not be open to accepting ideas from someone younger to them or lower in authority? I think Tanae has something in mind. So why don't we do this? I'm that older person. Try it. Let's do, are you willing? I don't see Tanae. If you want to turn your camera and voice on, let's see how we might do that. Big issue, right? In your culture, the respect for elders is paramount. That's why you're high context, right? I never understood that till the first time I came there. You know, you don't even let me get my second plate of rice, right? Somebody's going to serve me my dal. I can't go to the table myself and get it because you respect elders. In my country, we don't see that. There's not no respect. It's just not the same level. So this issue in your country of being able to have a conversation of disagreement with a senior person is really a good topic to talk about. How do we do that? Maybe we start with respect. The first thing elders want, and in their mind, they deserve is respect. And so you begin with a compliment of respect. And then maybe you confess. You say, I'm a little bit afraid to have this conversation with you. I'm nervous, right? I respect you. And maybe because of your stature, your status in my society or in my life, whatever it may be, if it's dad or grandpa or whoever it is, I respect your opinion, but I think our opinions might be different. So I'm a little bit afraid to talk about this. But I want to talk about it because I respect you. And I want your advice. So that might be how we start the conversation. Then depending upon what it's about, we can veer off of there. But my quick answer to that question is acknowledge respect, confess your fear, and express your desire for advice. Elders feel that that's their role in life. Some want to be the decision maker. The next part 4 would be, I respect your advice, but I want you to understand that it's my decision, not yours. That may not come right away in the beginning of that conversation, but that's where you want to go, is I respect your advice, but I'm not ready to say it's your decision rather than mine, or my family's, or my husband's, or my wife's, or whatever. Okay?
Thank you, Mr. Thomas Valenti, for your talk that addressed several pressing concerns around cross-cultural communication in our complex world. A world marked by diversity, differences, inequalities, and hierarchies. To me, this talk presented several new perspectives and pathways for further exploration. We are grateful to you for mapping many intersections of culture and communication, and we also hope to keep this dialogue alive. I thank my colleagues and students for being part of this session. Thank you once again. Good night.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the great questions. Sorry about the presentation, but I'll send that in a bit. I have another session now, but before my day is over, I'll send the PDF and you can distribute it to people.
Mr. Valenti, I would like you to meet our Dean, Dr. Madhuri Parekh, and
yes.
she has been listening to our session today, and it has been very informative for all of us.
Be happy to. Yeah, thank you. Nice. I
Thank
see
you
you.
so
Yeah,
much.
now I found your box. Yeah, I see you. Yeah.
Thank you so much to be with us. We would like to see you on the campus when the situation permits us.
I would love to be there. Yeah, I've been talking to one of your other, I don't know if Dr. Robinson is going to give a talk, but I spoke with him recently and we had a wonderful time. I don't know, was it 3 years ago now on campus? I've been on your campus a couple times and have great memories of the campus and the city and of course the hospitality. And so